So thank you all so much for coming. As she said, my name is Cortney, and I have an incredible group of panelists today. Hopefully you won't hear too much from me because I think they have a ton of things to say, and I'm very excited to help guide the conversation. So I'll just go ahead and let these guys introduce themselves, and then we can jump in. So do you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Justin Denton. I am a director and the executive technical director at Here Be Dragons. We're an immersive experience studio. I think the main reason why I'm here on this panel today is because I directed the Legion Sessions experience that was at Comic-Con, and then we remounted it at Future of Storytelling.
Great.
Hi, I'm Hector Harkness. I'm associate director at Punchdrunk. We're a UK-based theatre company, and we make immersive experiences too, but more along the theatrical vein, and we make all sorts of forms of show in that respect.
David Oppenheim. I am a producer at the Toronto studio of the National Film Board of Canada. NFB. NFB is Canada's public producer of auteur animation, interactive experiences, and nonfiction film. Our studio focuses on creative nonfiction, so I'm sort of firmly rooted in that world, but across both linear film and interactive nonfiction projects, so regardless of form or technology, but on the nonfiction side.
Fantastic. So a lot of what I think we're going to talk about today will dovetail with the amazing keynote that you guys just heard. Unfortunately, I don't have a fun bow tie, but you know, apologies for that. So the first thing I want to get started with is, how do we create a story world for folks that feels natural? And what I mean by that is, a lot of the times you go to these experiences, and I found this in my own life attending a lot of these events, you get very self-conscious. You have this idea that you are sort of participating on two levels. You are participating, and then you're sort of watching yourself participate. And what I want to know is, you've all done very successful experiences that really immerse people. How have you gotten people out of that space where they feel maybe self-conscious and gotten them into a space where they feel comfortable and that they are actually part of the performance?
Yeah, I think my biggest fear is that an audience member would feel self-conscious, actually. That's our kind of #1 rule in our work, is that it's absolutely not about that. And I think that feeling of kind of stage fright as an audience member can be awful, and it's something we dread. Like, I have childhood memories of being sort of pulled up on stage at a pantomime in the UK, which is a crazy art form. Everyone should try and see a pantomime at some point if you can. But that feeling of being exposed, yeah. So we always try and find the ways not to do that, and actually to really kind of empower an audience. The form of show that we've become most well known for is what we call a mask show. So we take over a large-scale building, we create a very detailed design installation within it, and we unleash an audience into that wearing masks. And so our show in New York at the moment, Sleep No More, we have kind of 400 people running around the building wearing these white masks that are kind of based on, originally, the Greek blank mask, and the idea that that kind of makes you sort of a nothing, and then your emotion can be expressed physically. And really, that for us, the mask is the key to this feeling of lack of inhibition. I think it does something quite interesting to the audience, because it sort of does two things at the same time. It allows the audience to become a sort of ghostly spirit around the space, so they can kind of disappear into the background if that's their urge, and kind of sink away into the shadows. And it means that it allows our performers to kind of emerge into the light and stand out in the space. But also at the same time, I feel like it frees up inhibition too, that the audience kind of will suddenly feel, because they're part of that ensemble of these 400 kind of blank faces floating around the space, that they're able to be bolder, dash around the building if they want to, and become a voyeur in a much more bold way. So a lot of moments in our shows are very small. You know, a character might be sitting writing a letter. In fact, when I was a performer to start off with our company, and when we first made Sleep No More in London, I had a scene that was a kind of gap within my show. I had no idea what to do in it, and it was quite improvisational at that point. Mm-hmm. This was kind of 10 years ago. So I decided to kind of sit at this desk and kind of write a letter by hand. and I was kind of alone in a room, essentially, because the audience number was very small, but I was kind of in role, and I was kind of scribbling away at this letter. And eventually, after kind of 10 minutes of that, I turned around, and there was this kind of sea of white faces watching over me, which had gradually built up over that 10 minutes.
And you're like doing your grocery list at this point,
I'm
right?
doing my grocery list, yeah. But so I think what the audience, what we were discovering about the audience then was that the feeling of the mask and being able to be this invisible presence allows them to become a voyeur in very intimate little moments like that one. It allows them to kind of disappear, be a ghost, and get very close to performers, and therefore make the performance hopefully much more kind of engaging and dynamic for them.
I'm glad you raised the pantomime point, because this is something that I hadn't really thought about until just now. I mean, I also spent a lot of time in the UK as a kid and did the pantomime thing, and also Punch and Judy, if you remember that fun play that's actually about domestic violence, but children watch it on a beach in the UK.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I don't think they have that anymore. They might have gotten rid of that. But, you know, there have been a lot of different types of interactive, even immersive theater in the past. Why are we hitting a point now where it's suddenly become like the thing to do, right? I mean, kids go to pantomimes, kids interact with different content. I mean, we've had these like murder mystery dinners that people seem to like for ages. How come these things are sort of all of a sudden becoming like newer, cooler, and entering the public consciousness?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's something to do with being hand in hand with what we're all here to talk about today, which is kind of digital worlds yeah, I think there's an instinct for the tangible at the moment, and yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think what Hector was saying is that there may be just a desire on the part of creators who are themselves audience members for various things, to kind of break some of the barriers that we've erected between the physical and digital worlds through 50-odd years of computer science. I mean, through various kinds of interfaces. So I think perhaps that's one of it, one of the reasons. And I mean, to your earlier point, one of the ways in which we, natural, as you say, can be defined in many ways, but one of the things that we focused on with Draw Me Close was on the tactile, on the merging of the physical world and the digital.
You should really try to. I saw it at Tribeca and had to go like hide in the bathroom and cry afterwards because it was so incredibly moving, and I don't think that's an uncommon response. But this leads into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is how do we break down the barriers between the real and the virtual worlds? I mean, you did an amazing job with that. You've done some really interesting stuff with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us it was motivated by, and I think particularly for Jordan, who was a skeptic coming into the process. It was developed in a lab that we had run December 2016 with the National, where we brought 4 theatre artists, 2 Canadian and 2 UK artists, theatre artists from different disciplines within theatre. And Jordan, who's just a sort of incredibly talented writer and theatre director with some background in film, was quite skeptical. And he talked a lot about a term which was new to me, not probably new to you, which is sort of the rough magic of the theatre. And I think for him, there was a day where it was a bit of a kind of a light switch turned on, and he was playing with tilt brush. And he took it in a direction, I think, that surprised us a bit. Not entirely, but he started to draw, but then started to pair up with an illustrator. And that's sort of where he got to that mechanic of drawing with a character, with someone in the physical world. And so for him and for the team that sort of worked with him, it was the kind of story and form, the intersection of that. So where it really worked well and where often these kinds of projects do is where story and form sort of and functionality intersect. And so you have a character who's, Jordan, who is it's a memoir about a relationship with his mother. So you're moving back and forth between time, between memory. So the illustrated world for him was sort of allowed him to work in that way and to illustrate those memories. And then the physical, you have a character that is the player, audience member who ultimately realizes they're embodying Jordan at certain points. And you have the mother. And so you have a relationship there that's one of trust, it's one of guidance, and so that notion of literally and figuratively of that sort of care relationship worked really well in that sense. And so you had the digital world and you had the physical, and they kind of reinforced each other. And so that barrier that would have been there, which is just the pure barrier if it was a pure digital piece, was broken down by the notion of the actor in concert with that player character. So,
Justin, do you have anything you want to add?
So Legion Sessions was a piece around the show Legion from Effects, and what we wanted to do with it was create an experience where you are the main character of the show, David Haller, which could put an immense amount of pressure on the person going into the experience, plus how do you make it feel real? So I feel like I can kind of answer the two previous questions together in one, which was that we really thought heavily through the user's journey with this. We knew we also had to introduce new technology to people that would probably have never even seen the HoloLens or maybe haven't heard of it, and most people haven't used it. So we had quite a few challenges that we had to deal with, and so we decided to focus on the story side of it first, the immersive theater side of it first, which actually we worked with Hector and Punchdrunk, so which was an amazing kind of collaboration. I think we had a lot of fun doing it. But we really kind of took a step back and thought through the entire user's journey. So we wanted to make sure that the blending into you going through the experience started before you even got there. So we created a fun, kind of 30-second teaser that people had seen on the site before they signed up. And then whenever they walked up to the building, it was actually its own freestanding building in San Diego on the lawn outside of Comic-Con. So as they walked up, they already saw this huge logo of the show, and there were no windows, you couldn't see into it, you had no idea what was going on. And so it kind of created this sense of mystery. And so as you're walking up, your mindset is already changing as a user. So you don't realize, oh, I'm actually already kind of in this experience, even though I have no idea that that's what's going on yet. So when you go up, they actually perform an eye test on you, a medical eye test, which is really just getting your IPD, your interpupillary distance, which definitely helps with the tech as far as the HoloLens working much better, but we changed it to where it felt like you were now being examined. So as the user, you're now going, okay, somebody is walking me through this experience. I have a guide, in a sense. And that really helps set the tone and kind of get you going, okay, I'm performing in this, but I'm doing what people are telling me to initially. And so we use that as kind of the way to gradually kind of get you going into the experience. So from there, you actually go and I wish you could walk straight in, but we had a little bit of a line, so you would wait just a little bit before you'd go in. And we actually had 4 rooms going simultaneously, which is kind of getting to that challenge of like how many people you can get through these experiences. So we had 4 different rooms. You would go into this big hospital waiting room, which is modeled after Clockwork's Hospital from the show. So when you're in there, we've got a number of people in character, and they introduce you to the HoloLens itself, but as a device that Carrie, which is a character from the show, had created. So now you're just all these little things of, instead of having to introduce you to tech, we're introducing you to story elements. So by the time you've got that on, we let you do this brain scan test. And while you're doing that, it's not about how well you're performing, it's just evaluating what you're doing. And so we noticed pretty immediately, I think even when we were doing some of our tests there, that people's anxiety would go down. It's like, oh, okay, I'm just playing with this thing. And then you go into this room where you're now by yourself with one actor, and you have this person who's very much leading you through it in a comfortable way before things go very, very sideways. Hopefully we'll get to remount it again, so I'm not going to say exactly what happens in that room.
No spoilers.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I actually want to talk about something you guys both mentioned, which is the presence in these experiences, right? Because you were clearly guiding people through a lot of that, and you have to, right? I mean, who in here has used a HoloLens before? Okay, so a couple, but not, and also this is an audience that I would expect to have a decent number of HoloLens users given the event that we're at, right? I think if I asked people on a subway train, I wouldn't get any raised hands. And then you have something like Sleep No More where people are much freer, right? They can just sort of enter, they have a premise, they have a mask, but they can just run around and do whatever. And there's not a lot of presence necessarily, if that makes sense. So how do you, when you're creating these events, how do you balance the need to guide people versus letting them choose their own adventures?
Yeah, so presence as in kind of agency and how they can affect something.
Right, or whether they are consciously part of it versus kind of just observing and also interacting.
Yeah. I mean, because as I say, sort of the mask shows are sort of one form of the performances that we make, and certainly with that, it's to do with light, sound, and the performance content. So, I mean, our mask shows are very, very dark. We use lighting to kind of, the lighting all works on a kind of loop in time with the soundtrack, and we essentially hit play on the show at 7 p.m. and then it kind of runs. Mm-hmm. And what that means is we've created a lighting plot that very carefully will draw a surge of audience through a door at a particular moment, we predict. Or the performers will be there to kind of facilitate that and to take someone's hand, or even it's kind of through their focus. The performers have developed a load of genius tricks about how they sort of might go to leave a room and glance behind them. It's the kind of like Hitchcock school of acting, I guess. Glance behind them in a mysterious way and then walk off down a corridor to kind of pull an audience with them. So yeah, there are kind of tricks within the mask show setup, which is a very controlled environment. But we've also, I mean, we're doing a lot of experimentation at the moment in terms of experiences out in the real world. We just did a show in London that was 5 or 6 hours long, and it's an adventure for a couple of people that starts in the centre of London, and they kind of head off on a mission. They're uncovering this, the lost cult of the Cabeiroi, who are a Greek mystery cult, who are calling out to them and wanting to initiate them into their cult. But that takes place very much in the real world, a huge amount of variables. And that was a really interesting process of playing around with the moments at which we can, for a particular hour, let the experience be free and then kind of hook those two people back onto more of a treadmill, essentially, by, you know, characters calling them, by hopping them into cars, speeding them off to a location. And it just feels really important because payoff and shape and kind of crescendo in our storytelling is kind of vital. And in order to do that, only a certain amount of agency, excuse me, feels possible, really.
Right, I mean, David, did you have something to...
Yeah, I think, you know, there's a sort of conversation around agency, and there has been. It's not just emerging, although it's quite part of the conversation in terms of so-called immersive storytelling, but whether it's sort of the early kind of computer narratives or experiments with interactivity, the notion of kind of local agency on one side or global agency on the other. So the idea of sort of local agency where you sort of can control aspects of your own experience in small ways, but the small ways don't add up to affecting the narrative, you know, to sort of the idea of global agency where you have much more of that ability. And I mean, I think you're probably really familiar with that in terms of video games or open world games versus different kinds of more linear narrative-based storytelling. So I think for us, that does have a bunch to do with presence in terms of degree of presence. It's not, to me, the same thing, but it's sort of trying to find that balance between what we were talking about earlier, sort of illusion of agency sometimes, where you feel like you're very much, from a narrative presence point of view, you're in that story, but there's the illusion of agency where you feel like you're there and you're not just an observer, but at the same time, you're not given global agency. And just, it's maybe a bias and where my experience is at, but I think that kind of illusion of agency makes creators' jobs that much easier in terms of telling, you know, good story well told, sort of the power of linear narrative. And so I think it's just something we wrestle with, but we tend to make work that kind of is on that continuum towards kind of illusion of agency.
Yeah, and we ran into some interesting challenges on the Legion project where you are going through this entire experience. It's just for you, which Draw Me Close has that kind of similar sensibility to it. But because we're also dealing with the HoloLens and it being AR, where you're seeing real people and computer-generated things happening at the exact same time, one of the real challenges we had there was and AI is a giant buzzword right now. Everybody keeps talking about it, but the reality for AI to be able to do things that we expect, especially after having done things like immersive theater, we're a ways from that type of AI happening. And so we actually kind of took a step back and said, well, let's not try to make the HoloLens do all this work of just doing voice recognition of I only have a very binary choice A and choice B. We wanted it to be much more natural in sensibility, and so we actually were controlling it through an actor. So one of our actors would be sitting kind of behind you, and they had a tablet that when you did certain things, they could trigger events based on how you reacted. So that way it gave it a much wider feeling of choice, and also we didn't have to rely on, say, maybe something like people are going to react in unexpected ways. I think we've all seen that in very unexpected ways sometimes. And it would be incredibly difficult for a kind of game-based app to be able to respond well to that, but an actor is going to be able to choose if they have options to, say, trigger an event to happen that they feel would work well there, or even a combination, which I think was more the case, a combination of that action plus them also adding some performance to it as well.
Yeah, so actors, don't worry, the robots aren't coming for your jobs anytime soon.
Well, I think that's an interesting point there, because for us, one of the exciting possibilities of working with the HoloLens there was that potentially all of the information that is contained within here can be multi-layered and go off in all sorts of directions, right, as it could if AI was fed into that. And therefore, things potentially do become more scalable, and you don't have to have the performer, the human sitting there and listening. So, I guess that's an excitement for the future, right?
Absolutely. But I think we would need to write something for that. I think that, in some ways, that wasn't just us responding to the limitations of where it's at now. That was actually a strength of the piece as well, in the ability for the actor to choose when those things would happen, So, in the piece, we don't actually do CG humans. We do have pre-recorded voice from talent from the show. So that way you get these recognizable voices, and if you really know the characters, that's really exciting to you that you get to hear them talk to you.
I didn't realize the HoloLens has the bone conducting stuff in, so the first time I heard that, and I have this crazy voice appearing in my head without wearing headphones, I was freaking out.
It was very accurate to the actual story, which he thinks he's schizophrenic at first, and then finds out that he actually has absorbed these people's consciousnesses. So it works quite well for the HoloLens.
Cool. So it's good that you brought up the HoloLens, because that's a segue into AR, which is something I'd like to talk about next. And I think the HoloLens is pretty far from being sort of a mass consumer object, at least at this point, because it's still very expensive and it's still pretty early stage. But with the release of AR Kit and AR Core, we're going to start seeing a lot more AR experiences on people's phones, right? There's already a bunch in the market. 2018 is going to be a huge year for that. My agency has gotten just a ton of AR projects that we're working on right now. And I think there's a lot of room for immersive storytelling AR projects, so people can be doing these immersive stories on their phones, which is great. The issue with that, though, is an issue, I think, of consent. And an example that someone raised for me was, there are AR apps right now where you can leave messages for people, right? So my husband and I each got one, and I will leave little funny notes for him around the house, and he'll leave funny little notes for me, and it's very cute. But there's a darker side to that, which is people could, for instance, put anti-Semitic graffiti notes on a synagogue, or anti-Muslim graffiti on, a safe space like that. So I guess the issue I'm trying to get at is when we're telling these immersive stories and we're in a controlled environment, right? We're at Tribeca, we're at, Sleep No More. People consent to be there, right? When you did Draw Me Close, you consented to being touched by this woman. When we start expanding these stories really into the real world and blurring these lines, how do we manage the issue of other people consenting to be part of these stories?
Just to say, we did design for that with Draw Me Close, and it is easier in that site-specific
right,
scenario. But not all designers do that. So I mean, I think it's not a given that that is controlled for or designed for, that sort of idea of consent. I think it is mostly a good idea, and it's not. I don't think it's new, in the sense that artists, specifically in mediums where I think you put your audience member in really close proximity to your art. I think more, we do it with film, in the kind of rating system and in all the messaging around a film. I think we have, perhaps you could argue, we have a greater degree of responsibility to our audience when we are working in a medium that puts people in such close proximity. We're dealing with physicality more so than in other mediums. But just to say, it's not a given that designers do control for that in kind of site specific. But I think the way in which we did might be instructive even if it were in a sort of dispersed or location-based, like an alternate reality game or AR type of applications. And that's just for designing touch points along the way. So for example, if you didn't know anything about Draw Me Close, most likely when you were lining up, you read the short synopsis. And so you read that it was a memoir of a relationship between a mother and a son. You were then, we actually did soon after, through, albeit a bunch of user testing, we weren't doing it at the outset, but we did ask about, if light touch is, you're okay with it. And we had a stage manager out front. And I think one thing we really learned is as amazing as festivals are in providing volunteers, that we actually needed someone from our stage management crew to do that. In part because it establishes the relationship with the cast, although not on stage, and the audience member. But to the point of touch points, I think Justin mentioned it earlier. So if you take that out of the site-specific realm, I think you can do that through designing touch points all the way through. So, for example, Blast Theory, which is a company of artists in the UK, do a lot of site-specific work. And if you haven't seen their stuff, really encourage you to check it out. But along the way, they've done pieces where you consent to be kidnapped so they've done sort of quite boundary-pushing stuff. And I think the way that they are successful in that is there's no one point at which you, in all of their experiences, where you sign a waiver, let's say, although I think some do involve that. But I think what they do is communicate to you in a way that says, look, we know, we're not trying to pretend 100% here. We know that we are creating this thing for you, and you're in good hands. And then along the way, there are various other aspects. And you talked about it in some of your, in Legion. So I think there are ways to do that. It's just we have to be cognizant of it.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you get away from site-specific, because in site-specific, not only do you have maybe the waiver scenario, which is great, legality, whatever, but as a creator, it's even more important than that. It's having amazing talent and a host that judge the situation as well. We have a moment that for some people in Legion is really terrifying, and for other people it's exciting, but that's they're going to be willing to get pushed a little bit further, and so your talent needs to be able to kind of assess that situation. We even had one where we had a very pregnant woman come through, and the host actually, she came and got me and was like, maybe you should have a conversation with her before she goes through. And luckily, I just happened to be in the moment right there, which had it not been, they probably would have grabbed Elizabeth. But I had a conversation with her, and I was like, hey, are you trying to have the baby here? If you are, let's go. I say, here, add this signature onto this paper or whatever. But, but she really wanted to check it out, so we modified it a little bit. So there's things like that. But once you get away from site-specific, it's really a completely different challenge, because people want that, and kind of this was your very, very first question. It's like people want these lines to get blurred. That's the reason why I think that's the reason why people are coming to this. Most of us I'm coming from, playing video games from since I can remember and things like that. And it's like we did all of that, and then we saw kind of, this thing that was happening with theater and got really excited about the merger of them. And so you get these people that really want these forms of interactivity to happen in the real world for them. you know, and I'm not going anywhere with this. I don't have an answer for you. You know, I think that's the big challenge of it, is that, like, you know, I come from a business of constantly signing waivers and NDAs and everything else. I don't think the average world is accustomed to that as maybe we are. So what does that mean when something has, you know, a waiver form on it? Are they going to view that the same way they view like a software agreement that they don't read, but it's actually incredibly important that they do read it? Yeah. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, I would just say that I completely agree about that. Like, this is the thrill, is that strange line between, and especially, you know, again, when I'm talking about our experiences kind of spilling out into the real world, the idea that that real world can, like, come and get you is the thrill. Like, to Brent's point about the, you know, the game, the Michael Douglas film, you know, that's, like, again, a great kind of inspiration, but that feeling that, like, anything is possible out there has to be upheld somehow, because it's the most thrilling part of all this, I think. I mean, I think in the UK, you know, like Blast Theory, we have, like, less of a history of needing to do disclaimers as over here, I think. So we've maybe been a bit more rogue about it. But yeah, we totally find those ways in our shows that, in fact, it's the kind of gradual, and it's mainly to do with performers actually really knowing the sort of subtle ways to ask permission of an audience member as the performance goes on.
Right.
You know, we buy a ticket, we buy popcorn, we settle in. And I mean, those conventions change now. We're, you know, subject to these lame mobile games that interact with the screen, and we kind of there's a lot of ads, but we kind of know the pacing of it. And I think, you know, we're in a, whatever you want to call it, early proto stage of kind of a lot of this stuff. It's not, you know, so those are developing, but those sort of conventions, I think, will take sort of the place of waivers. And I mean, you know, with sort of legal, I mean, yeah, I mean, ultimately it's about much more than that. And in a way, it's sort of an onboarding process, and it's an opportunity for designers to sort of design that in. But I mean, just, you know, I thought this might come up, but I kind of am curious as to how do you guys approach that with, or maybe you don't want to talk about it because it's downstairs, but there's a different approach that you guys took in my button's off, but in this experience, and
yeah.
You know, I'm torn, but it's a difficult balancing act, and you approached it differently. And I don't know if I put you on the spot or you don't want to talk about it.
No, it's fine.
In general,
I don't want to talk about it too much.
Yeah,
yeah. So just so people know what the experience that is downstairs is.
Oh yeah, so we
you can at least talk about that, because it is downstairs.
I thought you were going to say what
say so much.
This is the beginning of a new piece right here.
Yeah.
So, we just made our first, kind of year and a half ago, we made our first sort of foray into 360, which was a very fun experiment, which we've called Believe Your Eyes, but it never really had a title. It's just we, at some point, needed to find one. It's not my ideal title, really. But yeah, so it's run here kind of earlier on this year, and then we've brought it back for a couple of days here, so hopefully some people are going to see that. But it was our first experience of making kind of live-action 360 film, which was very kind of fascinating process in which I learned a lot. And actually, it's really, I haven't seen your piece yet, but I feel so convinced by VR worlds that are abstracted and CG often, that actually I found the kind of 360 film environment quite kind of restricting in a way. Since then, yeah, I've seen loads of wonderful VR pieces where I'm very convinced by the like the Ubisoft piece that's upstairs. Yeah. What's the name? Transference. Yeah. So that's set in it's a game, and it's set in a location very much like the kind of worlds that I would normally make within a live theatrical experience, and the you know, it's a simple series of rooms essentially, but the detail that you get within that CG world, the beautiful lighting, the kind of hazy atmosphere, a bit like this room, is kind of so wonderful that I feel it's sort of almost more easy as an audience member to kind of buy into that world and feel like you're present within it. And
yeah, and I mean, just, you know, to not give away too much, but I mean, I think it's there, and there's not just Believe Your Eyes, but a bunch of different experiences which handle this issue of consent in ways that integrate into into story, and into that contract between audience member who is now no longer removed, but kind of implicated in some way in the action. So there's kind of very creative ways to do that. Yeah.
Cool.
With the 360 video thing, it's kind of interesting. Like, this is an internal term we've been using, and it's definitely a misnomer, but we've kind of been calling it the Uncanny Valley of 360 video, because we've been hitting that a ton, and we've done a lot of 360 video. And it happens more on the narrative side. On the documentary side, you tend to be okay with it.
Yeah.
Whereas on the narrative side, there's just this immediate, like, my eyes are judging the situation, so I become analytical instead of emotional. And we rely so much on that emotion, especially what you guys do, that when you feel your audience slipping into that analytical place, you kind of lose them a little bit.
Yeah. But yeah, so I went kind of off topic there, but to the point of consent with this piece, our original version of it, the performer who appears within the piece would also show you into the room and put the headset on you. That's not too much of a spoiler, I think. But within that context, it's actually a very different way into the thing, which I think made people feel kind of very comfortable, whereas perhaps this version without that performer is a little more surprising.
So also after this day, if people are around for drinks, for those who experience it, there'll be an interesting side conversation where we can debate these ways.
So just to keep chatting about VR a little bit, I mean, VR still at this point is not very social, just because of the nature of the technology, right? You're in the headset, even if you're interacting with other people in the virtual world, you are still by yourself in the headset. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that people are doing now with touch in VR and sort of other ways to interact with people while they're in the headset. But I feel like we haven't gotten to the point where social in VR has been solved quite yet. So how do you guys see moving forward making these interactive VR experiences more social?
I mean, I just want to say first, I mean, I think that as creators, as makers, we should feel like we don't need to. I mean, I think it's something we talk about where, certain ecosystems, not to sort of go conspiracy theory, but I think it's fairly accepted that, if Facebook is putting billions into the Rift and, are very clearly building an ecosystem and technology where they are designing for social, I think you don't need to necessarily do that. And so as designers, as artists, as makers, you can take technology that evolves towards that kind of, those parameters and say, well, I mean, I'm just sort of interested in exploring that kind of solitary book under a covers kind of experience. So I think a lot of the stuff we're working on now sort of has that. And with pieces like Draw Me Close or others, I think partly what we're looking at is, they're not antisocial pieces, but they're sort of solitary in a way. But what we're looking at is points along the way where perhaps there's some connection to other people who are with you in that physical space. So it's something you can do with site-specific, where we may go and we may do something separately in a VR arcade or in a theater or a non-conventional theater, but we may be individualized, but we will meet up at some point, either in a narrative sense in the experience or just sort of after. I mean, I remember I spent most of Sleep No More alone because I just sort of chose to. But then in the space was designed, this restaurant and bar. And so it was it was probably one of the most social experiences I had. And probably even more so than the kind of, we go to a movie together, we talk about it after. I mean, that's kind of a very loose, almost to the point of being useless definition of social. But you can kind of, first of all, you don't have to, but then you can still design solitary, I think is what I'm trying to say, in experiences where they're social with, that is social more so that's a useful definition of social within the narrative, within the kind of world that you've created.
I would say probably that in the Sleep No More context, but that everyone's been off on a different journey. So that's where the social of the bar becomes so super important, is that people immediately want to share.
And you're talking about it in a way that, I did this, as opposed to, I saw this. And so, I mean, I think that's where it draws parallels to VR. I mean, I was wearing the simplest of headsets, which is a mask, but it was you know, it was designed for that. So, yeah, I mean, there's other ways, obviously, that people are experimenting with.
Yeah, I mean,
we talked about a bit.
Yeah.
I think that on the gaming side, I feel like that is being solved. So I wouldn't say we're that far off from it. Like, I'm part of a league for Echo Arena, you know. So I play that.
Do you want to tell people what Echo Arena is if they don't know? Because Echo Arena is pretty amazing.
It's by far my favorite VR game right now. So it's does everybody know Ender's Game? So it's very much like the league play, like where they're being trained in Ender's Game. So it's a zero gravity kind of capture the flag type of an experience, which is incredibly aggressive in the sense of motion. You can spin around, be completely upside down. All these things that were typically thought of as big like no-nos in VR, and they're pulling it off beautifully. Yeah. They do something really brilliant, which this isn't on topic, but I love it. I speak to the cockpit effect a lot in VR, where if you want to do something more aggressive, if you give people something that they're grounded to, often they're fine. And this can be any number of things. But in that piece, right when it starts, or that game, a mask is put on you, which is your helmet, but there's the little edges of the glass that you just see the edges of it, and that's just enough to keep you from getting ill. But anyways, on the social side, it's an incredibly vibrant community. It's becoming a part of the professional gaming community now. It even changed the way Oculus allowed you to set up the sensors. So like that was how important that game has become in kind of social VR aspects.
And the community in that game is incredibly diverse, at least the times that I've played it, and I play it very poorly. I had a 7-year-old, I think it was, make fun of me, which, you know, I'm bad at it, so I'll totally cop to that. But, you know, other than a child mocking me, I mean, there were people of all different ages and accents that I could detect from all over the world, but everyone looked essentially the same. So I think that was a really interesting example of, like, how do we make this more social, but also keep everything on this sort of level interactive playing field, is like that's one way to solve for it, where everyone is essentially the same robot, even if you have different voices.
Yeah, it's incredibly effective, and I think that one of the reasons why I wanted to bring that up is because we're obviously talking more about like narrative experiences as opposed to gaming, but there's so much we can borrow from that world.
Sure.
And you know, one thing that you know is an issue with being social in any gaming scenario is having goals that we have different responsibilities to make the same goal. And that's something where I think we just need to do a bit more of that in our narrative pieces. You know, like Life of Us is a ton of fun. It's upstairs now, and you get to go through that, and there's no objective that you know we have to do separately or anything, but the fact that we can look at each other, wave while we're morphing into these other things, and so then you're curious what your form is, so now I'm going to look at you because that'll inform me what I also look like. Yeah. So I think there were some really interesting, clever solves there. Yeah,
for sure. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, that's fine. Didn't mean to put you on the spot. Just to sort of continue talking about VR and other sort of immersive forms of entertainment, one of the things that's interesting to me about being in VR is that I am fully present once I have the headset on, and that's literally just because I can't look at anything else, right? The headset blocks everything else out. So I'm sure many of us are the type of people that are looking at our laptops, and we're also kind of looking out the window, and we're on calls, and we're staring at our phones, and we've got a million different things that we're doing multitasking, and VR sort of takes you out of that. But one of the challenges in VR, for me anyway, is I see a lot of interesting things and different experiences, and I want to share those immediately. I want to screen capture them and show them to my friends, or I want to send someone a text or a message, and I can't because I'm in the headset, and I haven't gotten good enough at texting to send people like blind texts. So how do we do we even want to? And B, if we do want to, how do we encourage people to be present in these immersive experiences, but also share them socially and sort of let other people know where they are and what they're doing? Like, how do we strike that balance? If we even want to strike that balance, maybe we want the immersive experiences to just be immersive and that's it.
I don't know. I don't think I have any. I don't think, you know, in the short time we've been working in the medium, I don't think we have any tricks except sort of just creating, you know, beautiful kind of, or trying to anyway, kind of create beautiful kind of complex or resonant art that people you know, just are engaged in. I mean, I think if you, I don't know, for me, I'm not actually, by putting on the headset, I'm actually, it doesn't guarantee my presence.
Right.
You strap up something to my face, I'm cut off from the world more than I am otherwise, if, you know, but I'm equally as likely to take it off if, you know, it's not a well-designed or a good story well told. So, I mean, I don't have specifics other than to say we should feel free to sort of design for experiences where you are present, you are, you know, you're not wanting to share it. It's not a two-screen experience like mobile and watching a TV show. And the way to do it is to create incredible kind of work, I guess. I mean,
yeah, I mean,
maybe the best way to do it.
This is where VR and AR differ so much, you know, and it's one of the things that I still love about VR is that I am, like, my device is either in my pocket or on a table or whatever, and, like, you know, and I tend to actually take it out of my pocket because I don't even want it to vibrate in my pocket while I'm doing something in VR because I don't want the distraction. And I like that it's requiring me to focus, whereas, you know, if I'm doing something that's AR, it's a distraction by its very nature, especially in the mobile sense. You know, so now you're just back into that sensibility of, you know, I think I'm capable of multitasking to a ridiculous degree because of how we operate.
But, you know, to address the Legion piece that you did, I mean, you know, FX is a huge company. I'm sure they have social media agencies working with them that were like, okay, this is cool. We spent probably a decent amount of money creating this cool experience for Comic-Con. We want to get this out. So how did you, when you were designing that, obviously, well, not obviously, but I'm guessing there was someone who was like, well, how do we share this? How do we socially share this?
Absolutely.
So how did you think through that?
Yeah, so, you know, for me, it was that the piece is an immersive theater piece that just happens to use the HoloLens as opposed to it being an AR experience. That being said, the thing that no one had seen was the HoloLens. And so what we did is and it's funny, we had originally written it where, and we had rehearsed it this way, where they took the headset off of you and took you out of the room. And what we actually did is we made an adjustment where the headset stays on you when you leave the room, and then you go into kind of this decompression area, which we haven't really spoke about user's journey, but I think it's incredibly important to, like, give people a place to decompress. That being said, we actually had a camera that could do, like, boomerang GIFs or stills of you while you were wearing the HoloLens. And then it had, like, graphics for Legion over the top of it, and it made it look like you were in Summerland from the show and those kinds of things. So everybody, when they left, they had this opportunity while they're still wearing the device to share what that was like along with the show itself.
Right.
Yeah, I kind of feel within my process of making projects, I think thinking about the shareability and how to do that is a bit of a trap when I'm getting going on the ideas for something. And I kind of feel like, yeah, if I make the strongest, most intimate, beautiful, personal experience, then we can work out the way for people to tell each other about it. However, I do feel this question of kind of, you know, handheld technology and how that can be kind of seamlessly fed into projects like ours, like the experience across London is really exciting. And of course, there's ways that can feed across into how you share that experience. But I think I'm very excited by kind of exploiting the kind of theatrical potential of one of these and what it can, how it can, I mean, that project, the Caballero projects across London, started off with the idea really that this would be the key to your narrative, and this is how we continue a sense of kind of crescendo to the piece. It's this that pulls you through. But also in the momentary drama that this can give you, there was a moment in that show where you're in the British Museum, and you've been on this kind of audio tour with this sort of soaring soundtrack as you pass by these old Greek statues, and then someone slips you a phone and your headphones are pulled off, and you've got this clunky old plastic Nokia, because we went really kind of lo-fi, and you receive a sort of anonymous text saying, go to the main doors and step outside under the arches, and you go out there and it says, we want you to participate in something. We might want to meet you at the end of it. Raise your hand if you agree to this. And you raise your hand, and when you look out from those steps, there's thousands of people kind of coming and going in front of the British Museum. So there's this sense of massive epic scale, and there's someone out there watching you. And it was really this that was giving us the dramatic beats, which feels like a kind of really exciting possibility, even if this tech was to get more kind of intricate than a basic Nokia.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that experience, which sounds amazing. The next time I go to London, I'm going to do it because it sounds very cool. Is that an experience that is then tweakable and repeatable? And by that I mean, let's say I go to London, I do it, I'm like, this is amazing. I got to show this to my friend. So my friend comes to London, and maybe she and I do it together. Are there ways where we can do it where it's not exactly the same experience that I've done before?
No.
Okay. That's
well, I mean, it was for a pair of people who went off on slightly different journeys.
Okay.
But so, you potentially can kind of switch there. But no, really, I mean, with that in particular, our massive struggle with that project was being able to control people through a 6-hour process.
Sure.
Sometimes it feels more free, as I said earlier, and sometimes it heads into locations where it's very controlled. But I would say that actually, even, with that project, which was very linear, you could come back to it 10 times and have a very different experience because it's the city, it's central London and the variables that that's giving you. And this kind of storytelling of look up around you and there being hundreds of people who are potentially characters within this thing, you're always going to get a different flavor, a different sense of paranoia, or your imagination is always going to create a slightly different story in moments like that.
So that's the reason I wanted to address this was this is probably the last question we'll do on the panel before we open it up to you guys. But one of the challenges that we have with a lot of this stuff right now is you do an experience once and then you've kind of done it. So I've done a lot of VR experiences where I do it once, okay, it's cool, it's interesting, and then I'm like, okay, I've done it. I know the story, I don't need to come back to it. And I get the sense that a lot of this stuff is not necessarily people coming back to it. And obviously, people come back to a lot of experiences they've done before, whether they're like rewatching TV shows, whether they are, going back and playing the same video games over and over. How do we, when we scale this to make it profitable, how do we sort of keep people coming back? Do we have to create different experiences every time? Do we just have to create something that people want to try again and again? Like, what are the challenges with getting repeat customers? Because we can't just scale a business where someone comes once and then they're done.
Yeah, I mean, there's something we can borrow from the television world in the sense of making those episodic. If you create something that people really like what you've created, not the novelty of it, but the actual world that you've created, because I think that's the big difference there. If it's the novelty of some little mechanism that you did and people are like, oh, that was really cool, I'm going to tell my friends to see it, that's not really going to make them want to see the next version of that same novelty. But if they bought into either the characters in it or the world that you've created, then you can add to that experience and just build out a universe from there. And I think that episodic sense for when you're not trying to create this infinite version of possibilities, I think as a storyteller, I'm more excited about that way to do it than creating just 18 million different ways that you can solve the same experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we, perhaps as a public producer, have a different imperative in terms of it's less about revenue generation, but the similarity is that we do make things for an audience. We want people to sort of come back to what the NFB is doing and what the creators that we're working with are doing. And I think, not to sound trite, but you do it by creating, great art. And your reference to sort of rewatching films or rewatching television. I think if I'm a fan of Legion or Sleep No More, I'll probably look for the next production. So from whether your business is getting as many Canadians or people around the world to see your work, or you need to sell tickets, I think repeatability across your projects is maybe where I come from. I will say, I mean, if people get a chance to see it, and it's maybe difficult to see, is Laurie Anderson's, I think it was her first piece, but called Chalk Room. And I saw it at a festival, but as a standalone piece, she did design for, I think, repeatability. And the way she did it was, I mean, I think to create this incredible world. It's sort of a series of spaces that you have a fair degree of agency in. And I think probably feel larger than they are. Sort of the world probably feels larger than it actually is. So, you know, I should say it's a kind of a limited test in that you were given 15 minutes in the festival to sort of go through it. But very quickly, because I tried to move through it quickly to see what it was there and to test the limits, it was sort of clear that she had created with her co-creator a world in which, I mean, as an art object, you wanted to go back into it. So, you know, there's the episodic kind of model, and I think maybe from the other end is kind of the art model. Beautiful pieces of art I'm going to put in my home, the ones that I can afford, and I'll go back to it. I'll walk past it many times, but I'll go back to it and watch it or spend time with it or engage in it in some way. And I think what she's done through different design and really good design and really good storytelling is she's created a piece that's kind of coming at repeatability from the art object side. And it's hard to do, but you know, I think she's done it. So you might have to take a field trip to Mass MoCA in Massachusetts, but chalk room. So that's another way to approach it, I think.
Cool.
We've been doing some work in London recently. We have this kind of series of warehouses, and we've built a village there, like within a couple of the warehouses. So there's like a village pub, there's a little high street with a church at the end, a square, a sort of the mayor's house. And at the same time, we've been building, you know, a digital version of that in Unity, like a game, essentially, that you can play. And we're going through this process of R&D where, I mean, we've created a show, essentially, in that space for school children. So local school children receive this game into their school. They're able to play this game that's about a village and explore it. And at some point, they might find on a bench in the village a little letter that gives them an address. When they go to that address, which is in Tottenham in North London, where our warehouses are, they then step into the village for real. And they explore that environment. They affect the storytelling that goes on in there, and that in turn affects the game version, which has these kind of different levels to it that they are, and those two versions really talk to each other, this live experience and the digital. And we're doing that process partly because we want more people to be able to access our, you know, even a show like Sleep No More in New York only has 400 audience a night, so it's kind of pretty small as big theatre shows go. That's why it's had to run
over how many years, though?
Yeah, so it's run for 5 years. Yeah. But you know, ideally people would have a kind of different sort of access to the world of that show as well. So that's where we're kind of working on this idea that, you know, to create a sort of digital version. It's a kind of a parallel universe to the one that exists within that warehouse that people can access, kind of hook into that story in some way, perhaps affect it. But what's exciting is that that digital world can change more than the world in the warehouse can.
I mean, it's a term that's not in vogue anymore, but you know, transmedia in terms of storytellers that are, you know, in the true sense where you know, each sort of world on a different platform or different place impacts the other in some meaningful way in a narrative sense. So, you know, I think it's a sort of episodic kind of a transmedia, to use an old-fashioned term, is a really interesting model to explore in terms of VR or AR experiences. But just to say, I mean, Sleep No More also is something that probably those who've done it in the room is also something that probably some of us have done twice. Right. So it is kind of also, although there's no ancillary, there's no transmedia component really, except for the kind of conversations happening in social and online. It's a repeatable one.
Yeah.
And it's,
Well, thank you guys all so much for coming. Round of applause for our amazing panelists.